Introduction to Loss of the Sultana and Reminiscences of Survivors by Rev. Chester D. Berry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Roger Moline. Introduction. The average American is astonished at nothing he sees or hears. He looks for large things. Things ordinary are too tame. This and the exciting events of April, 1865, perhaps account for the fact that the loss of the steamer Sultana and over 1,700 passengers, mostly exchanged prisoners of war, finds no place in American history. The idea that the most appalling marine disaster that ever occurred in the history of the world should pass by unnoticed is strange, but still such is the fact, and the majority of the American people today do not know that there ever was such a vessel as the Sultana, and many of those who do recollect something about the occurrence cannot tell whether it occurred in the Mississippi River, the Gulf of Mexico, or the Atlantic Ocean. And the purpose of setting them right and instructing others, thus holding in the memory of the present generation and those yet to be, the sufferings of the defenders of our country is the object of this sketch. The steamer Sultana was built at Cincinnati, Ohio, January, 1863, and was registered, as near as I can learn, at 1,719 tons. She was a regular St. Louis and New Orleans packet, and left the latter port on her fatal trip, April 21, 1865, arriving at Vicksburg, Mississippi, with about 200 passengers and crew on board. She remained here little more than one day, among other things repairing one of her boilers, at the same time receiving on board 1,965 Federal soldiers and 35 officers, just released from the rebel prisons at Cahaba, Alabama, Macon, and Andersonville, Georgia, and belonging to the states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. Besides these, there were 2 companies of infantry under arms, making a grand total of 2,300 souls on board, besides a number of mules and horses, and over 100 hogsheads of sugar, the latter being in the hold of the boat and serving as ballast. At Helena, Arkansas, by some unaccountable means, a photograph of the boat with her mass of living freight was taken, a copy of which is in the possession of L. G. Morgan, of Findlay, Ohio, one of the survivors today. Leaving Helena, the boat arrived at Memphis, Tennessee, about 7:00 p.m. of the 26th of April. Here the sugar was unloaded, many of the exchanged prisoners helping the crew, thus making a little money for themselves. Sometime in the evening, probably well towards midnight, the boat steamed across the river to the coal bins or barges and, after taking on her supply of coal, started on up the river for Cairo, Illinois. All was quiet and peaceful, many of the soldiers no doubt, after their long unwilling fast in Southern prisons, were dreaming of home and the good things in store for them there. But alas! those beautiful visions were dissipated by a terrific explosion, for about 2:00 in the morning of the 27th, as the boat was passing through a group of islands known as the Old Hen and Chickens, and while about opposite the Tagelman's Landing, had burst one of her boilers and almost immediately caught fire, for the fragments of the boiler had cut the cabin and the hurricane deck in 2, and the splintered pieces had fallen, many of them back upon the burning coal fires that were now left exposed. The light, dry wood of the cabins burned like tinder, and it was but a short time ere the boat was wrapped in flames, burning to the water's edge and sinking. Hundreds were forced into the water and drowned in huge squads, those who could swim being unable to get away from those who could not, and consequently perishing with them. One thing favorable for the men was the fact that there was a little wind, hence the bow of the boat, having no cabin above it, would face the wind until the cabin was burned off from the stern. Then the boat gradually swung around, the unburned part of the boat above the water acting as a sail, while that below acted as a rudder and finally drove the men into the water. A part of the crowd was driven at a time, thus giving many of those who could swim or had secured fragments of the wreck an opportunity to escape. But there was one thing that was unfavorable, and that was the pitchy darkness of the night. It was raining a little, or had been, and but occasional glimpses of timber were all that could be seen, even when the flames were the brightest. Consequently the men did not know what direction to take, and one man, especially, swam upstream. Another thing that added greatly to the loss of life is the fact that the river at this place is 3 miles wide, and at the time of the accident it was very high and had overflown its banks, and many, doubtless, perished after they reached the timber while trying to get through the woods back to the bluffs, the flats being deeply under water. Others died from exposure in the icy cold water after they had reached the timber, but were unable to climb a tree or crawl upon a log and thus get out of the water. Among the passengers on board were 12 ladies, most of them belonging to the Christian Commission, an association akin to that of the Sanitary Commission of the Army of the Potomac. One of these ladies, with more than ordinary courage, when the flames at last drove all the men from the boat, seeing them fighting like demons in the water in the mad endeavor to save their lives, actually destroying each other and themselves by their wild actions, talked to them, arguing them to be men, and finally succeeded in getting them quieted down, clinging to the ropes and chains that hung over the bow of the boat. The flames now began to lap around her with their fiery tongues. The men pleaded and urged her to jump into the water and thus save herself, but she refused, saying, "I might lose my presence of mind and be the means of the death of some of you." And so, rather than run the risk of becoming the cause of the death of a single person, she folded her arms quietly over her bosom and burned, a voluntary martyr to the men she had so lately quieted. In the official list the names seem to have been taken without reference to rank or state they were from. Sometimes, apparently, a squad from one company or regiment would be taken together, but often it was the case that they were all mixed up. In other cases many were left out. For instance, a sergeant came to me and asked to see the official list. It was shown him. "Why," said he, "there are but 10 of my company reported here, and I know there were 18 of us." This has been true in quite a number of cases. On December 30th, 1885, at a convention called in Fostoria, Ohio, there was a committee appointed, consisting of A. C. Brown, P. L. Horn, William Fies, A. W. King, and G. N. Klinger, to prepare a suitable memorial and present the same to Congress, praying for a pension for each of the survivors of the lost Sultana. End of introduction. Section 2 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 2. The Burning of the Sultana by William H. Norton, Company C, 115th Ohio. Midnight's dreary hour has passed. The mists of night are falling fast. Sultana sounds her farewell blast, and braves the mighty stream. The swollen river's banks o'erflow. The leaden clouds are hanging low, and veil the stars' bright silver glow, and darkness reigns supreme. Her engine fires now brighter burn. Her mammoth wheels now faster turn, Her dipping paddles lightly spurn The river's foaming crest. And drowsy Memphis, lost to sight, Now fainter shows her beacon light, As Sultana streams in the dead of night, And the Union soldiers rest. The sleeping soldiers dream of home; To them the long-sought day had come, No more in prison pens to moan, Or guarded by the gray. At last the changing fates of war Had swung their prison gates ajar, And laurel wreaths from the north afar Await their crowning day. For Peace has raised her magic hand, The stars and stripes wave o'er the land, The conquered foemen now disband As melts the morning dew, And mothers wear their wonted smile, And aged sires the hours beguile, And plighted love awaits the while The coming of the blue. On sails the steamer through the gloom, On sleep the soldiers to their doom, And Death's dark angel, oh, so soon, Calls loud the muster roll. A burst, a crash, and timbers fly, And flame and steam leap to the sky, And men, awakened but to die, Commend to God their souls. Out from the flames' encircling fold, Like a mighty rush of warriors bold, They leap to the river dark and cold, And search for the hidden shore. In the cabins, and pinioned there, Amid the smoke and fire and glare, The awful wail of Death's despair Is heard above the roar. Out on the river's rolling tide, Out from the steamer's burning side, Out where the circle is growing wide, They battle with the waves. And drowning men each other clasp, And writhing in Death's closing grasp, They struggle bravely, but at last Sink to watery graves. Oh, for the stars' bright, silver light! Oh, for a moon to dispel the night! Oh, for the hand that should guide aright The way to the distant land! Clinging to driftwood and floating down, Caught in the eddies and whirling around, Washing to the flooded banks are found The survivors of that band. End of Section 2. Section 3 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 3. Official Correspondence. Destruction of the steamer Sultana in the Mississippi River near Memphis, Tennessee, April 27, 1865. From the records of this department, it would appear that the steamer Sultana left Vicksburg, Mississippi, on April 24, 1865, and was destroyed in the Mississippi River near Memphis, Tennessee, on April 27, 1865. A court of inquiry was thereupon ordered by Major General C. C. Washburn, commanding District of West Tennessee, to investigate the facts and circumstances of the burning of the Sultana. On April 30, 1865, the Secretary of War instructed Brevet Brigadier General Hoffman, Commissary General of Prisoners, to inquire into the circumstances of the destruction of the steamer referred to, which officer on May 19, 1865, made the following report: Office of the Commissary General of Prisoners, Washington, D.C., May 19, 1865. Hon. E. M. Stanton, Secretary of War, Washington, D.C. Sir: Pursuant to your instructions of the 30th ultimo, I proceeded direct to Memphis, Tennessee, and Vicksburg, Mississippi, to inquire into the circumstances of the destruction of the steamer Sultana in the Mississippi River near Memphis on the 24th ultimo, by which calamity a large number of paroled prisoners who had embarked on her at Vicksburg lost their lives, and I have the honor to submit the following report of the result of my investigations. At Memphis, I learned that a court of inquiry had been ordered by Major General Washburn, commanding District of West Tennessee, to investigate the facts and circumstances of the burning of the Sultana, and at Vicksburg I learned that a commission had been ordered by Major General Dana, commanding Department of the Mississippi, to make a similar investigation. The court and the commission were about closing their proceedings when I arrived at Vicksburg, and finding, upon a perusal of their records, that all the testimony taken would be useful to me in forming an opinion as to the merits of the case, I determined to avail myself of a copy of them, which I was permitted to do through the courtesy of the generals by whom the investigations were made. In addition to the above, I obtained such further testimony that was within my reach, as I thought necessary to a full understanding of the matter. Upon a careful consideration of all the facts as presented in the testimony herewith submitted, I am of the opinion that the shipment of so large a number of troops, 1,866, on one boat was, under the circumstances, unnecessary, unjustifiable, and a great outrage on the troops. A proper order was issued by the general commanding the department for the embarkation of the paroled prisoners, and there were 4 officers of his staff who were responsible that this order was properly carried out, viz. Colonel R. B. Hatch, Captain in the Quartermaster's Department, Chief Quartermaster; Captain Frederick Speed, A.A.G., U.S. Volunteers, Adjutant General Department of Mississippi; Captain George A. Williams, 1st U.S. Infantry, Commissary of Musters and in charge of paroled prisoners; and Captain W. F. Kearns, A.Q.M., U.S. Volunteers and Master of Transportation. If there was anything deficient or unsuitable in the character of the transportation furnished, one or more of these officers should be held accountable for the neglect. The testimony shows that it was well understood by the 4 officers named that the troops in question were to embark on the Sultana. She was provided by the Master of Transportation with the approval of the Chief Quartermaster upon the order of General Dana, though not upon a formal requisition, and Captain Speed and Captain Williams were to superintend the embarkation. Nothing was known positively as to the number of men that were to go on board, but it was the impression that there would be from 1,200 to 1,500. Nor was any inspection of the boat made by either of the officers above named to determine her capacity or her condition. Neither one of them knew whether she had proper apparatus for cooking for so many men, or other necessary conveniences required for troops on transports. The troops were sent to the steamer from the camp in 3 parties, as is shown by the testimony of Mr. Butler, Superintendent of Military Railroads at Vicksburg, though Captain Speed and Captain Williams knew only of the first and third parties. The second party consisted of between 300 and 400 men. As the men were being embarked, Captain Kearns seems to have been satisfied that too many were going on one boat, and he so reported to Colonel Hatch, who agreed with him in this belief, but failed to interfere himself, as it was his duty to do so, or to make any report of the matter to General Dana, because, as he states, he had had a day or 2 before some difficulty with Captain Speed about the shipment of troops. There were 2 other steamers at the landing during the day, both of which would have taken a part of the men, and there was, therefore, no necessity for crowding them all on one boat. It only required an order from Colonel Hatch or a representation of the facts to the commanding general. Both Captain Speed and Captain Williams acted under the impression that there were only about 1,400 men to be forwarded, and having also a conviction that liberty had been attempted to induce the shipment of part of the men on the Pauline Carroll, they, during the day, resisted the proposition to divide the command between the 2 boats, in the belief that in doing so they resisted an attempt at fraud. It was not until the troops were all on board that they became aware of the fearful load that was on the boat, and then they seemed to think it too late to make any changes. But neither of them made any inspection of the boat to see whether there was room enough for every man to lie down. The testimony shows, and by a calculation of the area of the 3 decks, I am satisfied that there was scant sleeping room for all the men when every part of the boat from the roof of the Texas to the main deck was fully occupied. At night it was impossible to move about, and it was only with much difficulty that it could be done during the daytime. The cooking was done either by hot water taken from the boilers or at a small stove on the after part of the main deck, and owing to the limited nature of this arrangement, the difficulty of getting about the boat, and the want of camp kettles or mess pans, the cooking could not be very general. Before the troops embarked, there were on the boat about 60 horses and mules, and some hogs, 100 or more. The great weight on the upper deck made it necessary to set up stanchions in many places, in spite of which the deck perceptibly sagged. The impression seems to have been entertained that the paroled troops, having been so long suffering together in rebel prisons, were particularly anxious to go home together in the same boat, but there is no foundation for this belief. The men were exceedingly anxious to return to their homes, and were willing to put up with many inconveniences, but they felt that they were treated with unkindness and harshness when they were crowded together in great discomfort on one boat, when another equally good was lying alongside willing to take them. From the foregoing, I am of opinion that the 4 officers above named are responsible for the embarkation of so large a number of troops on an unsuitable vessel, Colonel Hatch and Captain Speed being the most censurable. It was their duty especially to see that the service was properly performed. Captain Williams was assisting Captain Speed, and seems to have felt that there was no special responsibility resting on him. But there was a manifest propriety in his knowing the number embarked, and if there was a deficiency of transportation he should have reported it. Captain Kearns made no inspection of the steamer to see that she was properly fitted up, but he did report her to Colonel Hatch, and also to General Smith, as being insufficient for so many troops, and his report should have been noticed. He made no report of the repairing of the boiler, which he seems to have been aware was going forward, and which it has not yet been decided positively was not the cause of the disaster. Lieutenant W. H. Tillinghast, 66th United States Colored Infantry, was the only other officer connected with this service, but he had no directing control. It is shown by his own testimony that a bribe was being proffered to him to induce him to use his influence in having some of the troops shipped on the Pauline Carroll, which he showed a willingness to accept, at least he did not reject it, and which he failed to report until after the loss of the Sultana. The testimony of the 4 officers above referred to is very contradictory, and I have formed my opinion from the general tenor of the testimony and the circumstances of the embarkation. Brigadier General M. L. Smith, United States Volunteers, had command of the district of Vicksburg at the time, but he had nothing officially to do with the shipment of the troops. Yet as it was officially reported to him by Captain Kearns that too many men were being put on the Sultana, it was proper that he should have satisfied himself, from good authority, whether there was sufficient grounds for the report, and if he found it so, he should have interfered to have the evil remedied. Had he done so, the lives of many men would have been saved. In reference to the immediate cause of the calamity, the testimony which I have been able to collect does not enable me to form a positive opinion. The testimony of the 2 engineers of the Sultana and of the inspector at St. Louis establishes that her boilers were in good condition on her leaving that port for New Orleans, and apparently continued so until her arrival within 10 hours' run of Vicksburg, when a leak occurred in one of her boilers. On the arrival of the boat at Vicksburg, this leak was repaired by a competent boiler-maker, and was pronounced by him a good job, though he qualifies the character of the work by saying that, to have been thorough and permanent, the 2 sheets adjoining the leak should have been taken out, and that, in its then condition, it was not perfect. The first engineer, Mr. Wintringer, testifies that after leaving Vicksburg he watched the repaired part of the boiler, which was near the front end, just over the fire bars, carefully, and it did not at any time show the least sign of giving way. When he was relieved from charge of the engine by the second engineer, the boilers were full of water and in good condition, and on their return to Memphis, the second engineer, Mr. Clemens, who being on watch at the time of the explosion was fatally scalded, told him before he died that the boilers were all right and full of water. I was told by another engineer at Cincinnati that he had said the same thing to another person on landing at Memphis, but this other person was not within my reach. There is nothing to show that there was any careening of the boat at the time of the disaster, or that she was running fast. On the contrary, it is shown that she was running evenly and not fast. A piece of boiler was obtained from the wreck, by order of General Washburn, which I examined. It seemed to have been broken from the bottom of the boiler the breadth of a sheet, and torn tapering to near the top of the boiler, tearing the iron like paper at times through the rivet holes and then through the middle of the sheet. The lower or wider end seems to have been exposed to the fire without the protection of water, and if so, this doubtless was the cause of the explosion. But this piece of iron may have been exposed to the fire of the burning vessel after the explosion, in which case some other cause must be found to account for it. The testimony of some of the most experienced engineers on the Western rivers is given to throw some light on the matter, but until the boilers can all be examined, no reliable conjecture can be made to account for the explosion. Thus far, nothing has been discovered to show that the disaster was attributable to the imperfect patching. It is the common opinion among the engineers that an explosion of steam boilers is impossible when they have the proper quantity of water in them, but the boilers may burst from an overpressure of steam when they are full of water, owing to some defective part of the iron, in which case there is generally no other harm done than giving way of the defective part and the consequent escape of steam. One engineer, who is said to be the most reliable on the river, said that even in such a case the great power of the steam having once found a yielding place tears everything before it, producing the effect of an explosion, and his view seems to be reasonable. What is usually understood as the explosion of a boiler is caused by the sudden development of intense steam by the water coming in contact with red-hot iron, which produces an effect like the firing of gunpowder in a mine, and the destruction of the boilers and the boat that carries them is the consequence. The reports and testimony show that there were 1,866 troops on board the boat, including 33 paroled officers, one officer who had resigned, and the captain in charge of the guard. Of these, 765, including 16 officers, were saved, and 1,101, including 19 officers, were lost. There were 70 cabin passengers and 85 crew on board, of whom some 12 to 18 were saved, giving the loss of 137, making the total loss 1,238. I have the honor to submit herewith the following papers in support of the foregoing opinions, viz. Testimony taken before the Court of Inquiry, ordered by Major General Washburn, marked A. Testimony taken before the Commission, ordered by Major General Dana, marked B. Testimony taken by myself, including testimony of Captain James McCown, 6th Kentucky Cavalry, taken before Colonel Badeau, of General Grant's staff, marked C, and the report of Major General Dana, Commanding Department of Mississippi, marked D. I have the honor to be, very respectfully, your obedient servant, W. Hoffman, Brevet Brigadier General, U.S. Army, Commissary General of Prisoners. Vicksburg, Mississippi, May 7, 1865. Will General Dana please state what officer or officers he considers responsible for the shipment of the paroled troops within referred to and for the proper character of the transportation? Very respectfully, W. Hoffman, Commissary General, Prisoners. Headquarters, Department of Mississippi, Vicksburg, May 8, 1865. Respectfully returned to Brigadier General Hoffman. Captain Speed was entrusted with the transfer and shipment of the prisoners and assumed full and active management and control of it, and I therefore consider him fully responsible therefor. The Quartermaster's Department was ordered to provide the transportation, and I consider Captain Kearns, Quartermaster in charge of transportation, responsible for the character of it. N. J. T. Dana, Major General. The report of Major General Dana is as follows: Headquarters, Department of Mississippi, Vicksburg, May 8, 1865. Brigadier General W. Hoffman, United States Army, Commissary General of Prisoners. In compliance with your verbal request this morning, I have the honor to report as follows regarding the shipment of paroled federal prisoners from here. The Commissary of Musters of this department, Captain George A. Williams, 1st U. S. Infantry, was, by my order in the latter part of March, placed in charge of duties pertaining to an Assistant Commissioner of Exchange, with a view to transaction of business with the rebel agents then in charge of federal prisoners of war who were arriving under flag of truce. The rebel commissioners having positively declined to turn over any prisoners till they received an equivalent, Captain Williams was sent, first to Mobile and then to Cairo, to communicate with Major General Canby, Lieutenant General Grant, and Brigadier General Hoffman. During his absence, Captain Frederick Speed, Assistant Adjutant General of this department, at his own suggestion, was assigned by me to the performance of Captain Williams's duties, and took entire charge of the receiving of prisoners from the rebel agents and of sending them to the parole camps at the North. During Captain Williams's absence at the North, orders were received, through me, by the rebel officials from Colonel Ould, rebel commissioner, by which they were induced to parole the prisoners, and I then ordered Captain Speed to prepare their rolls as rapidly as possible and send them North as rapidly as the rolls could be prepared, calculating as near as circumstances would permit about 1,000 at a load for the regular packets as they passed. The first load which was sent North was expected to be about 800, as that was about the number for which rolls were completed when the Henry Ames was expected. She was delayed, however, and by the time she was ready to leave, the rolls were ready for upwards of 1,300, and she carried them off. I had taken great interest in expediting the departure of these brave fellows to their homes, and I went down to see this load start. The next load was by the steamboat Olive Branch, which arrived so soon after the departure of the Ames that rolls for only about 700 were ready for her. After she left, Captain Speed came to me in considerable indignation and asked for authority to place Captain Kearns, the quartermaster of transportation at this post, in arrest. He stated that he had ordered all boats to be reported to him immediately on arrival and to await orders. That this boat had arrived in the middle of the night and had not been reported to him till 8 o'clock next morning, and that she had been unnecessarily detained after being loaded, and that he had been informed that this delay was made because she did not belong to the line which had the government contract, and that the contract line had offered a pecuniary consideration per capita for the men to be kept for their boats, and the intention was to detain the Olive Branch till one of the contract line came along to take the load from her. I directed him not to arrest Captain Carnes till he was satisfied, upon proper investigation, that the reports he had heard were well founded. The next boat was the Sultana, and she arrived so soon after the departure of the Olive Branch that Captain Speed reported to me that rolls for only about 300 men could be prepared, and that, therefore, none would go by her, but they would wait for the next boat. Captain Williams had arrived from the north in the night. Soon after making his first report, Captain Speed came to my office and reported that he had consulted with Captain Williams and had decided to ship all the balance of prisoners on the Sultana, as Captain Williams had advised that they be counted and checked as they went on board, and he would prepare the rolls afterwards. I expressed satisfaction at this and asked how many there would be, and he replied about 1,300, not to exceed 1,400, that the exact number could not be stated owing to discrepancies in the rebel rolls. About the middle of the day Captain Williams came and reported that the captain of the Sultana said he would leave in an hour or two, and that a large proportion of the men were still out at the parole camp, and he did not believe that proper exertions were being made to get them off, and that he had been informed that a pecuniary consideration had been offered per capita for the detention of the men and shipment of them on the other line, and he thought Captain Speed was practicing delay purposely for the detention of the men till the Sultana should leave and a boat of the other line arrive. I then informed Captain Williams of what Captain Speed had previously reported regarding Captain Carnes and his clerks, and stated that I thought he had the rumor wrong. He promised to investigate it, and afterwards reported to me that he was entirely mistaken as regarded Captain Speed. I also ordered a telegram to be sent to Captain Speed informing him that the boat would leave in an hour or two, and inquiring if any more men would go by her. After dark Captain Speed reported that all the men were in from camp. Up to this moment I considered that he had performed his difficult task with great satisfaction and efficiency. The next morning on visiting my office I inquired of Captain Speed whether the boat had left and was informed she had. I then inquired as to the exact number of men she had taken, and was astonished to hear that there were 1,900. Having never seen the boat, I inquired as to her capacity and as to the comfort of the men, and was assured by both Captain Speed and Captain Williams that the load was not large for the boat, that the men were comfortable and not overcrowded, and that there were very few boats which had so much room for troops as the Sultana. I had at first entrusted the whole exchange business to Captain Williams, but he having left Captain Speed was placed in charge of it, in addition to his other duties, by my orders. He assumed and managed it, as I thought, with ability, and I never had any report or complaint, further than is stated above, prior to the deplorable calamity to the boat, and was not informed of any circumstances in the details of the whole matter. I am, very respectfully, etc., N. J. T. Dana, Major General. The testimony referred to in General Hoffman's report is on file in this department. It is quite voluminous, however, and as his report was based upon that testimony and the report of General Dana, It is believed that the foregoing will furnish the necessary data bearing upon the destruction of the steamer Sultana. Respectfully submitted, F. C. Ainsworth, Captain and Assistant Surgeon, U.S.A., Record and Pension Division. To the Honorable, the Secretary of War. End of Section 3. Section 4 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 4. N. Whittringer, Chief Engineer. As I was chief engineer of that ill-fated steamer at the time of her explosion, I thought that my recollections of that terrible calamity would be of some interest. I believe that George Caton, one of the pilots, and myself were the only officers of the boat that escaped with our lives. Mr. Caton, if still living, resides in St. Louis, Missouri. I have not heard of him for some time. The Sultana left Cairo on that fatal trip the 15th of April, 1865, the day after the death of President Lincoln, and as all wire communications with the South were cut off at that time, the Sultana carried the news of his assassination and death to all points and military posts on the Mississippi River as far as New Orleans. I do not remember the exact date of our leaving New Orleans on our return trip, but on our arrival at Vicksburg we were ordered to report to carry a load of paroled soldiers, who, I believe, were from Andersonville and Libby prisons. While at Vicksburg we repaired a boiler. Now it was claimed by some at the time that this boiler was not properly repaired, and that was the cause of the explosion. In a short time those boilers were recovered, and the one that had been repaired at Vicksburg was found in good condition, whole and intact, and that it was one of the other three that caused the explosion. Now, what did cause this explosion? The explosion of the Walter R. Carter and Missouri in rapid succession, I think, fully answers that question. It was the manner of the construction of those boilers. After these three fatal explosions, they were taken out of all steamers using them and replaced with the old style of boiler. They were an experiment on the lower Mississippi. They had been used with some success in the upper Mississippi, where the water at all times is clear and not liable to make much sediment or scale. As I said before, those boilers were an experiment on the lower Mississippi and had not long been in use there, and it was the opinion of experts that it would have been only a question of time for all steamers using those boilers to have gone the way that the Carter, Missouri, and Sultana went, had they not have been taken out and replaced by others. I have one word to say for the engineer who was on duty at the time and who lost his life. It was talked around that he was under the influence of liquor. I can say for him, and all who were personally acquainted with him can say the same, that he was a total abstainer from anything of the kind. I went off watch on that fatal night while the boat was lying at Memphis Wharf at 11 o'clock in the evening of the 26th. I retired to my berth and did not know anything until I was aroused by the explosion, which occurred a few miles above Memphis, said to be about 2 o'clock in the morning of the 27th of April. That sight is as fresh in my memory today as it was 21 years ago, and I suppose to you, survivors, it is also. I stood bewildered for a moment, and then saw the river perfectly alive with human beings struggling in the water, and the cry from all quarters was, "Put out the fire," which was getting good headway by this time. But there was such a mass of confusion and such a complete wreck of the boat that nobody, apparently, could get out of the position they were in. I managed to get hold of a shutter and saw that the fire would soon force me off the boat. I took my chances and jumped into the river. I was not in the water long until I came across a gangway plank about 30 feet long and 15 inches wide. I abandoned my shutter for it. I was not there long until 4 others kept me company. There was just about enough buoyancy in the plank to keep our heads above water, and that was all. We floated in that manner for about 2 hours, when we lodged against a snag, when one poor fellow became so benumbed with cold that he could hold no longer and sank to rise no more. In a very short time after that we were picked up by one of the relief boats that came from Memphis and were taken to the city. There was supposed to be about 2,200 people all told on the Sultana at the time, of which about one-half were lost. I would like to attend the reunion if I could make it suit at the time to do so, and hear the experiences that will be given there. Hoping you may have a pleasant meeting of old friends to talk over the perils of that terrible night, and that not one of you may ever experience such another, is the wish of N. Wintringer. Note: This was written April 14, 1886, and he died October 11, 1886. End of section 4. Section 5 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 5. Henry J. Lida. I was employed on board the steamer Sultana, but left the boat about 2 hours before it left St. Louis for New Orleans on her fatal trip. In my estimation, it was carelessness on the part of the captain and engineer that caused the disaster. The Sultana's boilers were not fit for duty, as that steamer stopped at Natchez and Vicksburg on the last 2 trips before the explosion to patch and repair her boilers. She had the tubular boilers, which have been done away with since that time. My post office is St. Louis, Missouri. I am also a member of Frank P. Blair Post No. 1, Department of Missouri, and a pensioner of the United States. Certificate, Navy No. 1894, having served on the gunboat Essex. End of section 5. Section 6 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 6. C. W. Abaduska. I was born in the state of Maryland, August 15, 1844, and enlisted in the service of the United States at Waldron, Michigan, August 6, 1862, in Company F, 18th Regiment, Michigan, Volunteer Infantry. I was captured at Athens, Alabama, September 24, 1864, and confined in the Cahaba, Alabama prison. When the Sultana exploded, I was asleep on one of the hatchways and jumped off into the water, supposing that we were near the shore, but when I found out that I was mistaken, I got aboard the boat again and made a raft and went ashore on it. I was picked up about 10 a.m. Occupation, manufacturer. Post Office, Waldron, Michigan. End of section 6. Section 7 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 7. Hosea C. Aldrich. I enlisted in the service of the United States in August, 1862, in Hillsdale County, Michigan, as Sergeant in Company G of the 18th Michigan Volunteer Infantry. I was captured at Athens, Alabama, the 24th of September, 1864, and was confined in prison at Cahaba, Alabama, and released from there April 12, 1865, and went to Vicksburg, Mississippi, where I went on board the boiler deck of the steamer Sultana with the other prisoners, like a flock of sheep, until her passengers numbered 2,141, over 6 times her capacity. She steamed out of Vicksburg April 25th at 1:00 a.m., arrived at Helena, Arkansas, the 26th about 7:00 a.m., and arrived at Memphis, Tennessee, the 26th of April at 7:00 p.m. Here we stopped for a while, and I went uptown and got some refreshments, and I went back on the boat well fed but weary. A comrade, J. W. Dunsmore, and I bunked on the floor about midway on the cabin deck, the only place I could find, as the floors of all the decks were completely covered when all of the boys lay down. We left Memphis about 1:00 a.m., April 27th. There was no danger manifested, and more than that it was not in the least anticipated, only that the boat was heavily loaded. But in the darkness of that morning, between 1 and 2 o'clock, opposite Zegelman (or Tegelman) Landing, 8 miles above Memphis, suddenly and without warning the boiler of the steamer exploded. When it happened I was sound asleep, and the first thing that I knew or heard was a terrible crash. Everything seemed to be falling. The things I had under my head, my shoes, and some other articles and specimens that I had gathered up and had them tied up in an old pair of drawers, they all went down through the floor. We scrambled back. The smoke came rushing up through the passage made by the exit of the exploded boiler. The cry from all was, "What is the matter?" and the reply came, "The boat is on fire." It was all confusion. The screams of women and children mingled with the groans of the wounded and dying. Brave men rushed to and fro in the agony of fear, some uttering the most profane language and others commending their spirits to the great ruler of the universe. The cries of the drowning and the roaring of the flames as they leaped heavenward made the scene most affecting and touching. But it was of short duration, as the glare that illuminated the sky and made visible the awful despair of the hour soon died away, while darkness more intense than ever settled down on the floating hulk and the victims of the disaster. I was pushed in the water and started for the bottom of the Mississippi, but I soon rose to the surface and found a small piece of board, and soon had the luck of getting a larger board, which was very lucky for me, as I could not swim. At this time a comrade grabbed me. I released his hold by giving him the small board, another comrade had got hold of the middle of the large board. Then there came an end of a ladder in my reach. I grabbed it and pulled it under the board. Another comrade was on the other end of it. That was the craft which we 3 hung to and managed to keep away from others that were fighting and drowning. We floated along down the river nearly an hour, I think, when my limbs began to cramp. That was the last of which I was conscious until at 8:00 a.m. We had floated down the river 6 miles and lodged in the floodwood against an island which was within 2 miles of Memphis, and here we were picked up by the United States picket boat Pocahontas. They poured whiskey down me, rolled and rubbed me, and finally brought me back to life. I was like the newborn babe, not a raveling of clothing upon me, in a place surrounded by persons whom I had never seen before, but I was happy as a lark to think I was rescued and saved. They placed me on the stretchers and carried me to the Overton Hospital at Memphis, gave me a shirt and drawers, and placed me in a good bunk. The 3rd day, as soon as I was able to get up, they issued a suit of Uncle Sam's blues for me, and I was happy, without as much as a postage stamp, for I thought I might live so as to tell the story to friends at home, and I am glad that I have the opportunity to give this short and hasty sketch. I was discharged from the service of the United States at Jackson, Michigan, July 1865. Note: now deceased. End of section 7. Section 8 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 8. Daniel Allen. I was born at Fair Garden, Tennessee, on the 7th of September, 1843. I enlisted in the service of the United States in Sevier County, Tennessee, a private in Company K of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, October 3, 1863. Was captured by the rebels at Athens, Alabama, September 24, 1864, and was confined in Cahaba Prison until March 16, 1865, when I was paroled, reaching parole camp near Vicksburg March 21st, and was ordered to parole headquarters at Camp Chase. But before reaching that place, the sad event took place which calls for this narration. My escape and rescue from the ill-fated vessel were attended with much interest and excitement. The first I knew of the terrible disaster I was awakened, while in the stern of the lower deck, by the cry, "She's sinking!" and the shrieks and cries of the wounded and the terror-stricken comrades. I pressed toward the bow, passing many wounded sufferers, who piteously begged to be thrown overboard. I saw men, while attempting to escape, pitch down through the hatchway that was full of blue curling flames, or rush wildly from the vessel to death and destruction in the turbid waters below. I clambered upon the hurricane deck, and with calmness and self-possession assisted others to escape. At length, realizing that there was but little time to be lost, I divested myself of all clothing, and throwing a plank out, jumped into the water 16 feet below. I was at once grappled by 2 drowning men who held on to me until I climbed into the bow of the boat to release myself from their hold. I then descended the cable and made for the Arkansas shore. I was in the water 5 hours when I was picked up by a lifeboat. I was taken to the hospital at Memphis, Tennessee, where I remained a day or 2 and then went to Camp Chase, Ohio. I was discharged from the service at Nashville, Tennessee, June 10, 1865. My occupation at present is that of farmer and stock dealer. My present post office is Allensville, Tennessee. End of section 8. Section 9 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 9. Hiram Allison. I was born in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, December 4, 1830, and enlisted in the service of the United States at Muncie, Indiana, December 1863, in Company G, 9th Cavalry. Was captured at Sulphur Trestle, Louisiana, September 25, 1864, and confined in the Castle Morgan prison at Cahaba, Alabama, until March, and then was taken to be exchanged at Big Black River, Mississippi. I got on the boat Sultana at Vicksburg. She was crowded to her utmost capacity. Arrived at Memphis April 26th in the evening, where she discharged a lot of freight. Some of the boys went uptown, but I stayed aboard. As near as I can tell, we left about 12 or 1 o'clock that night. I was on the hurricane deck, close to the wheelhouse, lying down, and was just beginning to doze when all at once I heard the crash. I jumped up the first thing and saw a great hole torn through the hurricane deck and fire coming through. I stood a few minutes and looked at my surroundings. I concluded to take to the water. I climbed down from the hurricane deck to the cabin deck and took off all my clothes but my drawers and shirt, and then glanced around the burning wreck and saw that I would have to go, so I jumped from the cabin deck into the water. I remained there for 2 or 3 hours and then came across a horse trough with a comrade on each end of it. I took the center. When I caught up with the 2 comrades, they were both praying. When I got on with them, I said, "That was a terrible disaster." They made no reply but kept right on praying. I said no more to them, and when it was light enough for me to see they were gone. What became of them I never knew. I stayed on the trough till I got to some brush and logs on the Arkansas side. Then I bid it good-bye about 5 miles from the ill-fated Sultana. I was taken to Memphis with others. I was put in the Overton Hospital, remained there a few days, and then turned my face homeward. I was scalded on my legs and cut on the head. Post office address is Muncie, Delaware County, Indiana. Occupation, carpenter and joiner. End of section 9. Section 10 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 10. George Anderson. I was born in Wayne County, Ohio, on the 20th of July, 1838. I enlisted in the service of the United States August 6, 1862, in Wayne County, Ohio, in Company F, 102nd Regiment Ohio Infantry, and never missed any duty from the time of enlistment up to the time of being captured. A small detachment of our regiment was sent to reinforce our troops at Athens, Alabama, in the fight there against Forrest's command. We were taken prisoners September 25, 1864, and taken to the prison at Cahaba, where we remained until March 16, 1865, when there was an exchange of prisoners, and we were sent to Vicksburg, Mississippi, where we went on board the steamer Sultana, which was to take us up the river to Cairo, Illinois. When we arrived at Memphis, Tennessee, 2 of my comrades and myself got off and went up into the city, and while there, I can assure you, I did not expect to be there in the morning. Got on board the steamer again, on the hurricane deck near the pilot house, my 2 comrades and myself bunked for the night under one blanket. We were asleep at the time of the explosion. I was thrown out of reach of anybody and saw nothing of my comrades after the explosion. I swam about in the water for a time and finally got a piece of railing that was thrown from the boat and stuck to that and floated down the river with Mr. Horn from Worcester and 2 others, their names I have never learned, 2 miles below Memphis, making in all 9 miles. We were picked up by a gunboat and put on board a steamer that was anchored there for that purpose. When taken out of the water I found that I was hurt in the left shoulder and breast, and I feel it to this day. I was taken to Memphis where I remained a few days and then was sent to Columbus, Ohio, where I remained a short time and was discharged from the service and sent home. I now reside near Seville, Medina County, Ohio. My present occupation is farming. End of section 10. Section 11 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 11. P. S. Atchley. I was born in Sevier County, Tennessee, on the 12th of December, 1842. Enlisted in the service of the United States at Knoxville, Tennessee, on the 5th of November, 1862. as a corporal in Company K of the 3rd Regiment of Tennessee Volunteers. Was on duty at the Battle of Athens, Alabama, when the Confederate forces, under the command of Gen. N. B. Forrest, captured that place and were immediately transported to Cahaba, Alabama, as prisoners of war, and remained there in close confinement for about 6 months, when we were paroled out on the 16th of March, 1865, and sent to Vicksburg, Mississippi, where we went on board the ill-fated steamer Sultana. We were highly elated with the thoughts of going home and seeing loved ones, when suddenly, as we were a few miles above Memphis, Tennessee, one of her boilers exploded and hundreds of souls were ushered into eternity. My experience on that terrible morning no pen can write nor tongue can tell. I was thrown into the surging waves of that mighty river, into the jaws of death, and life depended on one grand effort, expert swimming, which I did successfully, and after swimming 6 or 7 miles, according to statements given by citizens living on the banks of the river, landed on the Arkansas shore without any assistance whatever. There I found a Confederate soldier who came to my relief and took me to a house near by and gave me something to eat, and I felt something like myself again, thanks to the great Ruler of the universe. The said Confederate soldier worked hard to save the lives of the drowning men and brought to shore in his little dugout about 15 of them. A number of comrades got out at the point where I did. Among them were some Ohio men, for whom I have great respect, but have lost their names, especially one of the 24th Ohio Regiment that got out of the water at the same time I did. I gave him my blouse and slips as he was naked. If he is yet living I would like to hear from him. I will close by wishing God to bless every survivor. My present occupation is farming. Present post office address, Trotter's Store, Tennessee. End of section 11. Section 12 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 12. Murray S. Baker. I was born in Canton, Wayne County, Michigan, and enlisted in the service of the United States at Plymouth, Wayne County, Michigan, 24th day of July, 1862, in Company D, 4th Michigan Cavalry. Was captured September 30th, 1864, and confined in the Cahaba, Alabama prison. In the spring of 1865 I was taken to Big Black River and turned over to the Yanks. I did not keep a diary and cannot remember details. After lying in camp a while we were taken to Vicksburg and put on board the Sultana. I tried to get close to the boiler, but it was full there, so I lay down by the stern door, beside Frank Nevins of the 18th Regiment Michigan Volunteers and another comrade of the 25th Regiment Michigan Volunteers. He was lost. I sat up till 12 o'clock, cooking rations, and then lay down and went to sleep. How long I had been sleeping I do not know. I was awakened by the explosion and sprang to my feet and looked around. Someone said the boat was sinking. I went out on the stern and saw that it was not, and so went back. It was one of the worst sights I ever witnessed. Men who were scalded and bruised were crawling over one another to get out of the fire. I went to the side of the boat and pulled a board off to help me get ashore with, but a big Yank grabbed it away from me. Then I got another off from a bunk and went down to the wheelhouse and threw it in the water and then jumped after it. My limbs cramped, but I kept paddling. I tried to get to one side of the shore, but could not, and then I tried the other side, and by hard work I got on some floodwood. When I reached it I was about exhausted, and could not speak, and laid there until I was rescued. Was discharged at Detroit, 28th of June, 1865. Occupation, farming. Postoffice address, Williamston, Ingham County, Michigan. End of section 12. Section 13 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 13. Otto Barden. I was born in Worcester, Wayne County, Ohio, August 28, 1841, and enlisted in the service of the United States at Worcester, Ohio, August 8, 1862, in Company H of the 102nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry, just in time to take part in protecting Cincinnati from being destroyed by Kirby Smith. Was then sent to Louisville, Kentucky, against General Bragg, and followed him through the state of Kentucky 375 miles, back to Bowling Green for winter quarters, which were cold cornstalk camps, for we had no tents that winter of 1862 and 1863. On Christmas Eve of 1862 we recaptured Clarksonville, Tennessee, on the Cumberland River. In the fall of 1863 we were sent to guard the Chattanooga Railroad, then back to Nashville, Tennessee. In the spring of 1864 we were sent to guard the Tennessee River, and in August 1864 we were sent after General Wheeler along the Chattanooga Railroad and drove him across the Tennessee River. From here we went to Decatur, Alabama, and on September 24, 1864, a detail was made at 1 o'clock at night, consisting of 250 of the 102nd Ohio Regiment and 150 of the 18th Michigan Regiment, to go to Athens and see what was the matter. We got within 5 miles of Athens when we met General Forrest's whole brigade. We drove him 5 miles and fought with him for 3 hours, when we found that we were surrounded and out of powder. In a charge we lost our best officers and were out of ammunition. We had to surrender on the 24th of September, 1864. We were sent to Cahaba, Alabama, where we were held as prisoners until the latter part of March, 1865, when we were taken out on account of the high water, the Alabama River having risen so high that we were waist deep in water for 5 days. The rebels sent us to Vicksburg, where we remained in parole camp. While here we heard of the sad news of the assassination of President Lincoln by a rebel. The prisoners became wild with indignation and started for the rebel headquarters. The rebel major that had charge of us fled across the Big Black River Bridge for safety until we learned the particulars of the President's death. We were put on the steamer Sultana. About 2,400 men were on their way to God's country, as we called the North, and we all felt happy to know that we were on our way home and that the war was over. Hallelujah, amen. On the morning of April 27, 1865, I was in the engine room of the steamer, sound asleep, lying by the side of the hatch hole with 7 others of my regiment, when the explosion took place. First a terrific explosion, then hot steam, smoke, pieces of brickbats and chunks of coal came thick and fast. I gasped for breath. A fire broke out that lighted up the whole river. I stood at this hatch hole to keep comrades from falling in, for the top was blown off by the explosion. I stood here until the fire compelled me to leave. I helped several out of this place. I saw Jonas Huntsberger and John Baney go to the wheelhouse, then I started in the same direction. I tried to get a large plank, but this was too heavy, so I left it and got a small board and started to the wheel to jump into the water. Here a young man said to me, "You jump first, I cannot swim." This man had all of his clothes on. I had just my shirt and pants on. I said to him, "You must paddle your own canoe. I can't help you." Then I jumped and stuck to my board. I went down so far that I let go of my board and paddled to get on top of the water. I strangled twice before I reached the top. Then the young man caught me and he strangled me twice. By this time I was about played out. I then reached the wheel and clung to it until I tore off all of my clothes with the intention of swimming with one hand. I looked around and recognized Fritz Saunders, of my regiment, by my side. I said, "Saunders, here is a door under the wheel. Let us get it out." We got it out and found it had glass panels in it. I said, "Let this go. Here is a whole door." The rest on the wheel took the first door and we started after them with the other. We had not more than started when a man swam up and laid across the center of our door. I looked back and saw the wheelhouse fall. It had burned off and fell over. If we had remained there 1 minute longer it would have buried us in the fire. I said to Saunders, "Let's go to the right. It is nearer to shore." He replied, "No, there is a boat. I will paddle for it." And when we were in the center of the river the steamer was about out of sight. We met 3 young men clinging to a large trunk. They grasped our door for us to steer them into the timber. We had not gone far until these bore too much weight on our door. That put us all under the water. I gave the trunk a kick and raised on the door and brought it to the surface of the water. Then I said, "Boys, if you don't keep your weight off of the door, then you must steer the trunk yourselves." By this time I was cold and benumbed and was in a sinking condition, but having presence of mind, I reached and got my board and called aloud for God to help. I rubbed my arms and got the blood in circulation again. Soon we were among the timber on the Hen and Chickens Island, clinging to trees, but being too cold and benumbed to climb a tree. I had the good luck of finding saplings under the water. I put my foot in the fork and raised myself out of the water. I soon got warm and swam to a larger tree and clung to it, but was not there very long until I got so cold that I fell from the tree into the water. I swam to the same tree and clung to it and called aloud for God for his assistance. I saw a man break open this trunk. It contained only ladies' dresses, so it was no help to us. One of these men that had clung to the trunk was so cold that he drowned with his arms around a tree. We were on these trees until about 9:00 a.m. It seemed as if the gnats and mosquitoes would eat us alive. We were rescued by a steamer sent in search of us from Memphis. The captain of the steamer that picked us up ordered hot coffee and whiskey (you bet we took it), and the Christian Commission furnished us underclothing, and the third day Uncle Sam gave us a suit of clothes, free. On the fourth day we took a steamer for Cairo, and were sent from here to Camp Chase and discharged May 21, 1865. Present occupation, carriage trimmer and post office, Wooster, Ohio. End of section 13. Section 14 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 14. William Barnes. I was born in the present state of West Virginia, June 15, 1842, and enlisted in the service of the United States in Athens County, Ohio, April 22, 1861, in Company H, 22nd Regiment Ohio Volunteers. I was captured at Decatur, Georgia, July 22, 1864, and confined most of the time at Andersonville, Georgia. At the time the Sultana blew up, I was thrown from the boiler deck and very badly hurt, but was fortunate enough, with 3 unknown comrades, to get hold of a bale of hay, upon which we floated till nearly opposite the city of Memphis, where we were picked up by a boat. My present occupation is that of a miner, and my postoffice address is Nelsonville, Ohio. End of section 14. Section 15 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 15. George Bement. I was born in Mason, Cass County, Michigan, November 6, 1841, and enlisted in the service of the United States at Adamsville, Michigan, August 3, 1862, in Company F, 25th Regiment Michigan Volunteers, and was captured at Cedar Bluffs on the Coosa River, Alabama, October 10th. I was confined first at Selma and afterwards at Castle Morgan, Cahaba, Alabama. As to my experience on board the Sultana, about all I can say is that I got very wet and quite cold. I reached shore somehow all right. My present occupation is farming, and my postoffice address is Adamsville, Michigan. End of section 15. Section 16 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 16. Chester D. Berry. Chester D. Berry, born August 1, 1844, at South Creek, Bradford County, Pennsylvania, removed when 10 years old to Michigan, thence to Minnesota, and back again to Michigan. Enlisted August 18, 1862, at Marshall, Michigan, in Company I, 20th Regiment, Michigan Volunteer Infantry. Served with that organization in all its campaigns, except Fredericksburg, at which time I had typhoid fever, until I was captured June 2, 1862, at Cold Harbor, Virginia, and taken to Pemberton Building, Richmond, Virginia, where I was confined for a while, then taken to Andersonville, Georgia, arriving there June 16, 1864. Here the rations, which at first were small enough, kept diminishing, until the 1st of September, 1864, there were but 2 tablespoonfuls of very coarse corn meal, the same of stock peas, with about 2 ounces of fresh beef, and wood enough to about half cook the rations. The beef first, then the peas were eaten raw, and the meal made into a gruel and drank. About the last days of October, 1864, we were removed to Millen, Georgia, thence to Savannah, and down the railroad to Blackshear Station. Were kept here in the woods with a heavy guard around us for about 2 weeks, then taken to what was at the time the end of the railroad at Thomasville, Georgia. Were kept here about 2 weeks, then marched across the country 60 miles to Albany, Georgia, there put on board the cars and taken back to Andersonville, entering the prison the second time on Christmas Eve, 1864. Here we remained, with scarcely a ray of hope, till the 25th day of March, 1865, when we were put on board the cars, taken to Montgomery, there transferred by boat to Selma, thence by rail to Meridian. Here we were kept overnight, where my pocket diary for 1864 was stolen from me. In it I had recorded the exact amount and kind of rations drawn for every day while in prison. From Meridian we were taken to Jackson, Mississippi, then marched across the country to the Big Black River, crossing it on the first day of April, 1865, lacking 1 day of 10 months that I had been in the hands of the Confederate authorities, and I could not say yet that I was out of their hands, for we were put into a camp called Camp Fisk, which is 4 miles from Vicksburg, and were under a Confederate major, but fed, clothed, and sheltered by Uncle Samuel. We understood at the time, and I do still, that our government had made a proposition to the Confederate authorities that if they would remove their prisoners onto neutral ground they might still have control of them, but our government would feed, clothe, and shelter us. I never experienced a happier day in my life than I did when we marched under the old Stars and Stripes at the Big Black River Railroad bridge and drew my first cup of coffee and a single hardtack. It looked like a stingy way for Uncle Sam to do business, but the boys who served us told us that when the first squad of prisoners arrived that they, the cooks, kicked open the boxes of hardtack among them just as they had been in the habit of doing among themselves, and the result was that there was a number of deaths before night. So we were happy with our meager rations, finding more joy in looking up at the old flag that we loved so dearly than in anything else, and it seemed to us that the all-wise ruler had gotten up a bit of sunshine and a small breeze in order that we might see the glorious emblem of liberty proudly unfold itself and kiss the sunshine. I have seen many beautiful things in my life, but never anything that looked more beautiful than the flag of my country did upon that first day of April, 1865. We remained at Camp Fisk for about 20 days. Then 1,965 prisoners who had been exchanged were placed on board the Sultana, where there were already a number of passengers and 35 exchanged officers, the entire number of persons being a little over 2,300. You will notice that the number of prisoners, officers, and men was just 2,000. I understood at the time, and have had no reason to change my mind, that it was a contrived plan with the United States quartermaster at Vicksburg and the captain of the boat. I will explain. At the fall of Vicksburg, General Grant gave many of his men furloughs to go home and recruit themselves after their unusually hard service. The officers of the steamers, knowing that the men would pay almost any price, charged exorbitant rates for fare to Cairo, Illinois. The men paid what was charged, but, just before the boat started, General Grant learned what had been done. He at once sent an officer to tie up the boats and ordered that all but $5 from each private and $10 from each commissioned officer be refunded. The government adopted that rule, and whatever troops were sent by private boats, they were allowed $5 per man for transportation. There were a number of boats at Vicksburg at the time we, the exchanged prisoners, were to be sent north, but all demanded the $5 per man and would take but 1,000 men. Finally the quartermaster succeeded in persuading the captain of the Sultana to take the entire 2,000 at $3 per head. That would give him $6,000 for the trip, whereas if he only took 1,000 at $5, he would only make $5,000. The report said that the captain of the Sultana signed the papers for $10,000 and that the quartermaster cashed them on the spot for $6,000. How true that was I cannot tell, but I know it was believed among the men at the time. All went gay as a marriage bell for a while. A happier lot of men I think I never saw than those poor fellows were. The most of them had been a long time in prison, some even for about 2 years, and the prospect of soon reaching home made them content to endure any amount of crowding. I know that on the lower deck, We were just about as thick as we could possibly lie all over the deck, and I understood that all the other decks were the same. The main thought that occupied every mind was home, the dearest spot on earth. I well remember, as the boat lay at Memphis unloading over 100 hogsheads of sugar from her hold, that my thoughts not only wended northward, but I put them in practical shape. The Christian Commission had given me a hymn book. At the time I left home the song "Sweet Hour of Prayer" was having quite a run. I found this, and before the darkness had stopped me in the evening I had committed those words to memory and sang them for the boys, little dreaming how soon I should have to test the power of prayer as well as the hour when it was held. The last that I remembered that evening was that the boat was taking on coal across the river from Memphis, preparatory to going up the river. There had been considerable talk among the boys that it would be a grand opportunity for guerrillas. If they only knew that there was such a boatload of prisoners coming up the river, how they could plant a battery on the shore, sink the boat, and destroy nearly, if not all, of the prisoners on board. Consequently, when the terrific explosion took place and I was awakened from a sound sleep by a stick of cordwood striking me on the head and fracturing my skull, the first thought I had was that, while the boat lay at Memphis, someone had gone up the river and prepared such a reception for us, and what had only been a talk was now a realization. I lay low for a moment, when the hot water soaking through my blanket made me think I had better move. I sprang to the bow of the boat, and turning, I looked back upon one of the most terrible scenes I ever beheld. The upper decks of the boat were a complete wreck, and the dry casings of the cabins falling in upon the hot bed of coal was burning like tinder. A few pails full of water would have put the fire out, but alas, it was 10 feet to the water, and there was no rope to draw with, consequently the flames swept fiercely up and back through the light wood of the upper decks. I had often read of burning vessels and nights of horror on the deep, and almost my first thought was, "Now take in the scene," but self-preservation stood out strongest. I went back to where I had lain and found my bunkmate, Busley, scalded to death. I then secured a piece of cabin door casing, about 3 or 4 inches wide and about 4 feet long, then going back to the bow of the boat I came to the conclusion I did not want to take to the water just then, for it was literally black with human beings, many of whom were sinking and taking others with them. Being a good swimmer, and having board enough to save me even if I were not, I concluded to wait till the rush was over. The horrors of that night will never be effaced from my memory. Such swearing, praying, shouting, and crying I had never heard, and much of it from the same throat, imprecations followed by petitions to the Almighty, denunciations by bitter weeping. I stood still and watched for a while, then began wandering around to other parts of the boat, when I came across one man who was weeping bitterly and wringing his hands as if in terrible agony, continually crying, "Oh, dear! Oh, dear!" I supposed the poor fellow was seriously hurt. My sympathies were aroused at once. Approaching him, I took him by the shoulder and asked where he was hurt. "I'm not hurt at all," he said, "but I can't swim. I've got to drown. Oh, dear!" I bade him be quiet, then showing him my little board, I said to him, "There, do you see that? Now you go to that pile of broken deck and get you one like it, and when you jump into the water, put it under your chin and you can't drown." "But I did get one," said he, "and some one snatched it away from me." "Well, then, get another," said I. "I did," said he, "and they took that away from me." "Well, then," said I, "get another." "Why," said he, "what would be the use? They would take it from me. Oh, dear! I tell you there is no use. I've got to drown. I can't swim." By this time I was thoroughly disgusted, and giving him a shove, I said, "Drown then, you fool." I want to say to you, gentle reader, I have been sorry all these years for that very act. There was little or no rush for the water at that time, and had I given my board to that poor fellow, then conducted him to the edge of the boat, and seen him safely overboard, he might perhaps have escaped, while as it was, I have no doubt that he was drowned. If he was not, and should ever see this, I wish he would write me the fact. But some one may ask, what would you have done without your board? I could have got another from the pile of rubbish, which would have been a very easy matter, and I have not the faintest idea that anyone would have tried to take it from me, for, as the boys tell about, I was not built that way. After looking at the burning boat as long as I cared to, and as the waters were comparatively clear of men, I sprang overboard and struck out for some willows that I could see by the light of the burning boat, they appearing to be about 1/2 mile distant. I had gone about 20 or 30 rods when, hearing a crash of breaking timbers, I looked back. The wheelhouse or covering for the wheel (it was a side wheel steamer) had broke away partially from the hurricane deck, and a poor fellow had been in the act of stepping from the hurricane deck on to the wheelhouse. I presume it was then the hurricane deck fell in. When it reached an angle of about 45 degrees it stopped, for some unaccountable reason, till it nearly burned up. He succeeded in reaching the wheelhouse, but got no further, for it broke and let him part way through, then held him, as in an iron vise, till he burned to death, and even now, after the lapse of years, it almost seems as though I could hear the poor fellow's screams as the forked flames swept around him. I then turned and pressed forward towards my haven of safety, but soon became aware that I was not gaining upon it. The fact was, I was swimming toward a small island, and was, in fact, now swimming upstream, but was not aware of the truth. The icy water was fast telling upon my weak system, and the moment I became aware that I was being carried away from the timber instead of gaining it, I became completely discouraged, the only time I think in my life. Being now quite despondent, I had about concluded that there was no use of my trying to save myself, that I would drown in spite of my efforts, and that to throw my board away and sink at once would be only to shorten my misery. I was just in the act of doing so when it seemed to me that I was transported for the moment to the old house at home, and that I was wending my way slowly up the path from the road gate to the house. But, strange for me, when I reached the door, instead of entering at once, I sat upon the step. My mother was an earnest, devoted Christian, also my father had been, but father was deaf and dumb, consequently the family devotions fell to mother, and I knew that in the years of my home life, that if one of the family were away from home during the hour for prayer, 9 o'clock in the evening, that one was especially remembered in the prayer. As I sat upon the step I thought it was 9 o'clock in the evening, and as plainly as I ever heard my mother's voice I heard it that evening. I cared but little for the prayer until she reached that portion that referred to the absent one, when all the mother soul seemed to go up in earnest petition, "God save my boy." For 10 long weary months she had received no tidings from her soldier boy. Now she had just learned that he was on his way home, and her thoughts were almost constantly upon him, and for him her earnest prayer was made. I fiercely clutched the board and hissed between my now firmly set teeth, "Mother, by the help of God, your prayer shall be answered." I started out for a grand effort. Just then I heard a glad cry from the burning boat, and looking around discovered that past the boat, down the river, 2 or 3 miles as near as I could judge, was the bow light of a gunboat. I turned and was now obliged to swim past the burning boat, for I was up the river about 80 rods above it. When nearly past the boat, which I kept a safe distance to my left, I ran into the top of a tree that had caved off from the bank and whose roots were now fast in the bed of the stream, upon which I climbed, and was nearly asleep when a number of men from the boat came along and climbed upon it also. Their united weight sank it low into the water, whose icy coldness coming upon my body again awakened me. Then, to more fully arouse me, a man got hold of my board and tried to take it away from me. I remonstrated with him, but he claimed the board belonged to him and that I was trying to steal it. This fully aroused me. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. Giving the board a quick jerk, I sprang backward and went swimming down the stream on my back, holding my board high lest I might lose it. I soon turned over and proceeded more slowly. I began again to have an almost irresistible feeling of drowsiness. I was cold and sleepy. Just then I came across, or thought I did, a dry black ash sapling about 2 1/2 or 3 inches in diameter at the butt and 6 or 8 feet long, that pronged in 2 branches about 3 feet from the butt end. I put this with my board and trying them found they would float. I then gave myself up to sleep and did not awake until long after sunrise. I then stood upon a large snag in the river that was pronged or forked, something like I imagined the black ash sapling was in the night. I stood on the lower prong, which was about a foot under water, while the upper prong was nearly 2 feet above the water, and what to me was stranger than all, I had, instead of the little board, 4 inches wide and about 4 feet long, a 2-inch plank, about 4 inches wide and about 6 feet long. I was out of my head and imagined that some terrible danger threatened me, but if I could only get that plank upon the upper prong of the snag, all would be safe. I soon came to enough to know that I was working a useless scheme. Then I realized that it was worse than useless, as it would take some of my strength to hold the plank on the snag, while it would do me no good whatever. I then abandoned the project and began to cry with the pain of my fractured skull, but I soon stopped that also, saying to myself, "Crying does not ease pain." Then came the first clear thought of the morning, and I realized what had happened, and that I was about 5 rods from the woods upon the Arkansas shore, the shore itself being under water. Quickly shoving my plank into the water, and starting for the place where the shore ought to be, which was the most foolish move of all, for when I arrived there and had pulled myself up a small cottonwood tree, I was surrounded by a perfect swarm of buffalo gnats, which made lively work for me, and although I had firmly seated myself upon a limb of the tree and employed both hands with bushes whipping them off my neck and breast, the only parts that were exposed, which were a solid blotch in less than an hour. Had I remained on a snag in the river, I would have been free from the gnats and nearer passing steamers, by which I hoped to be carried away. I remained in this tree but a short time, perhaps an hour or more, when the steamer Pocahontas came along, picking up all the men they could find. I soon attracted attention and was taken on board the steamer, and soon after landed at Memphis, and was then taken to Washington Hospital, where my wound was poorly dressed, as I remember it, none of the broken pieces of skull being taken out. I remained here a little over a week, and although I gave my name, company, and regiment to a reporter, and also to the hospital steward, yet about 2 or 3 months afterward my mother received official notice from Washington that her son was killed upon the Sultana, and my name stands today upon the Michigan Adjutant General's report for 1865 as killed by the explosion of the steamer Sultana. Yet, when in after years I applied for a pension for that fractured skull, which was so bad that the surgeon at Washington Hospital told the man in the next bunk to mine that I could never get well, I was obliged to prove that I was upon the Sultana and that I was hurt or had my skull fractured at that time. Such is the ease with which pensions are procured, and such the liberality of the government officials when they have the official evidence in government reports before them. After my brief sojourn in Memphis, I, with others, was placed on the steamer Belle Memphis and taken to Cairo, remaining there overnight, thence via Mattoon, where we were obliged to wait a few hours for cars. Here I was obliged to go hungry, or beg from the citizens, although I had a meal ticket at the eating house given me by the Christian Commission, but the landlord refused to honor it. From here we were taken to Indianapolis, where another halt was made, then on to Columbus, when I was sent to Tripler Hospital and doctored up for about 2 weeks, then sent to Jackson, Michigan, to be mustered out of the United States service on special telegraphic order from the War Department. My present occupation is minister of the gospel. Post office address, Tecumseh, Michigan. End of section 16. Section 17 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 17. William Boor. I was born in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, January 20, 1825. Enlisted in the service of the United States October 5, 1864, as a private in Company D of the 64th Regiment Ohio Volunteer Infantry at Sandusky, Ohio. Was captured at Franklin, Tennessee, November 30, 1864, and confined in prison at Meridian, Mississippi, Cahaba, and Selma, Alabama. I was finally released from prison and sent to Vicksburg, Mississippi, arriving there March 19, 1865. Remained in camp until the 22nd of April, I think, when we received orders to break camp and be ready for our homeward journey. The train from Vicksburg came on time. The Ohio men were first called, and, responding promptly, were taken aboard the train and landed at Vicksburg. We were then ordered to fall into line and march aboard the steamer Sultana. When going on board, my attention was attracted by the noise and work at the boilers going on at that time. We were marched to the hurricane deck and informed that this was to be our place of abode, but I thought different. I turned to Comrade William A. Hewlett, and, asking him to take charge of our clothing which I had at the time, I went below and looked at the boilers, which were not very favorable to my mind. I went back to the boys, told them that we had better look for some other place, and that I thought that there was danger, and if the boat should blow up and we were on that deck we would go higher than a kite. We started for the deck below, taking our position at the head of the stairway. 6 of us took our places here and enjoyed ourselves the best we could considering the crowded condition of the boat, all looking ahead to the happy time when we should reach home to see our loved ones. While thus apparently everything was moving along smoothly and swiftly, if not to our comfort, in the stillness of night on the morning of April 27, 1865, about 2 o'clock, we were awakened by the exploding of the boiler of the boat, the cracking of timbers, wailing of men, and the screams and moaning from the wounded, and the frantic men rushing to and fro, not knowing what to do, while the flames were madly rushing through the broken kindling of the boat cabin. It soon cleared the boat of its human freight. When the explosion occurred we all, except one, rushed out from under the wreck. Comrade Thomas Brink was fastened in the wreck. I commenced clearing away the broken timbers that were about him and got him out. We went downstairs. I asked him if he could swim. He said, "Yes, I can swim," and I told him I could not swim, but would meet him somewhere on the shore. I was not, however, permitted to realize that happy event, but was forced to the painful thought that he had perished, and the gallant Thomas Brink was no more. After I parted with my friend on the bow of the boat, I went upstairs and got in under the wreck of the cabin roof. There I dressed and took my rubber blanket and a spare shirt and tied them up, expecting if the board could carry me it could also carry my clothing, for I thought they would come good after having been in the icy cold water for a few hours. Now I thought that I was prepared for any event that might overtake me. I went down to the boiler deck. While there I had a good view for quite a distance around the burning boat. It was a most distressing scene to see hundreds of men in the water pleading for help, clinching one another while they would hold on to each other, going down by the dozens at a time. At the same time I wonder how so many were saved as were, laboring under so many disadvantages, hundreds of them being thrown into the air as soon as the explosion took place, scarcely having time to awake out of sleep, and plunged into the water which was almost icy cold. The time for me to escape was now at hand, for the fire was sweeping through the stairway. I had taken a survey of the river and made for the side which I thought was nearest the shore. Comrade Crawford, of the 102nd Regiment, and I started for the same place. At my saying to him we would have to leave, he led the way, and I waited until the way was clear again. While waiting my bundle caught fire, and as I struck the water I heard a hissing noise caused by the water coming in contact with the fire. Here I met with an accident which came near proving fatal to me. I got into one of those whirlpools in the water, and while there I could not manage my board. I finally got tired out, and then for the first time I thought I must give up the struggle and drown, as I could not get away from there. I finally concluded to dive to the bottom and get a good start, not thinking that the water was 40 or 50 feet deep in the channel. I went down, but it was not long before I was in need of the fresh air. When I came near the surface of the water, as luck would have it, I cleared the pool and got my board. I rested a short time and made up my mind to get to the wheelhouse of the boat and get on it and stay there until picked up, or go down with the burning boat, but in trying to get there I came across a board about 8 feet long. I put my other board under this and got on the other end of the board which projected about a foot out of water. I got a good start. When I came to the bow of the boat there was a man doing his best to keep his head above water. He called to me to know if that board would not carry us both. I told him we had got where everyone must be for himself, and that I could not swim, and had to depend on that board to bring me to safety. He told me that he could not swim, and pleaded for me to aid him. I could not withstand the plea, and told him if he would get off in case the board would not carry us both, he could get on with me. It proved sufficient, and we floated downstream and landed on the Arkansas side of the island, opposite Mound City, where a rebel captain got us out on a rail raft, which he had made so as to cross to the island. When rescued, I was so chilled that I had no recollection of being rescued or taken off the board. After getting on land, I have some recollections of how I fell over, as I could not walk or stand, but I got hold of the fence and held on to keep up. Although it was daylight, with me it was all darkness. The last that I could remember was hearing some ladies tell me to go to the fire. How long I was unconscious I know not, but before my sight came to me I began to revive. I could hear some of the remarks that were made, and also could feel that someone was washing my face, but did not understand the meaning of this. When I awoke I found myself before a big fire in the yard. A man handed me a bottle, I took it and was soon satisfied that I knew what it contained. I handed it back to him and said, "I do not drink whiskey." This was the first I uttered after being rescued. There were 9 of us rescued at this place, Mound City, and were well treated by the 2 families that lived there. A widow gave us a good meal and made us as comfortable as possible while we were there. The steamboat Pocahontas came along and took us on board for Memphis, Tennessee. When we arrived there, the ladies of the Christian Commission supplied us with underclothing. I took an ambulance for Overton Hospital, where I changed clothes and went to bed and soon lost myself in sleep. Those of us that were able to go north were sent out of the hospital to the Soldiers' Home for dinner. In the evening about 200 or more took a boat for Cairo, Illinois, where we landed on the following evening. A grand reception was given to the soldiers at Mattoon, Illinois. I was discharged from the service at Camp Chase, Ohio, May 17, 1865. My occupation is whipstock making. Post office address, Sandusky, Ohio. End of section 17. Section 18 of Loss of the Sultana by Chester D. Berry. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 18. William Bracken. I was second lieutenant in Company D, 88th United States Colored Infantry. At the time the Sultana blew up, I was officer of the picket guard on the Wolf River and was close enough to hear the shrieks and groans of the wounded and drowning soldiers and crew, but was powerless to aid them for want of boats. The United States picket boat Pocahontas picked up all who were alive next day. On board the Pocahontas were a number of soldiers belonging to the 113th Regiment Illinois Volunteers, the regiment to which I had formerly belonged, and they said that the general impression among the survivors was that the boilers had been tampered with and that the boat was blown up purposely to cause the destruction of the soldiers on board. One or more of the employees of the boat were also of this opinion, and they so expressed themselves. I visited the hospitals in Memphis and saw the most heart-rending sight I ever witnessed. My post office address is Putnam, Illinois. End of section 18.